There are places in the woods where the darkness doesn't just settle, it swallows. Places where no matter how much moonlight touches the trees, the shadows seem thicker, heavier. I never used to think much about it. I'd camped alone plenty of times, and the night had always been just that, the night. Dark, quiet, familiar. But this night was different. I was camping near a river, a small one, barely deep enough to reach my knees, its surface broken only by the occasional rock jutting out like the spine of some buried thing. The woods around me were dense, thick with towering trees that blocked out most of the sky, but I wasn't too deep in. I could still find my way out in the morning. I had spent most of the evening sitting by my tent, watching the fire burn low, listening to the sounds of the forest. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen animals moving through the underbrush. I should have felt at ease. This was routine. I had done this a dozen times before. But something felt off. I didn't know what it was at first. Just a feeling. A weight in my chest that made me glance over my shoulder more often than usual. The fire flickered, its glow stretching into the trees, but the darkness beyond felt deeper than it should have. Almost as if it was pressing in, waiting for the flames to die. I didn't like it, so I decided to take a walk. It wasn't something I normally did after dark, but I told myself I just needed to clear my head. Maybe stretch my legs, get away from the fire's glow for a bit. I grabbed my flashlight and followed a narrow dirt path that ran alongside the river. The ground was uneven, the roots twisting underfoot, but I walked carefully, keeping the water to my right. The river moved slow, smooth, reflecting the trees like a perfect mirror. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and moss. Then the light changed. Or rather, it disappeared. 1 second, the trees around me were bathed in the weak glow of my flashlight. The next, I was surrounded by complete, suffocating blackness. My chest tightened. I stopped walking, gripping the flashlight tighter, and clicked it off, then on again. The beam flickered to life, illuminating nothing but the path ahead. But something was wrong. A moment before, I could have sworn I had seen light. Not my own, not the flashlight, but something else. A faint, silvery glow coming from the trees. I had seen it. I was sure of it. And now it was gone. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The feeling in my chest tightened. I turned slowly, trying to find the source of the light I had seen. Nothing. Only darkness. The trees were just outlines against the night sky, towering and unmoving. The fire from my camp was nowhere in sight. I looked down at the river, and there, in the water, I saw myself. My reflection was clear, clearer than it had any right to be. The water was still, too still, the surface undisturbed despite the gentle flow of the current. It was like looking into a sheet of black glass. I stared at my own face, my own eyes staring back. But something about it made my stomach twist. It wasn't wrong, exactly. It was me. But it wasn't right either. The longer I looked, the worse it felt. The eyes in the reflection were mine, but they seemed too empty. My face was expressionless, hollow. The dark circles under my eyes looked deeper, my skin paler. Like something had drained all the life from me. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from seeing something supernatural. No ghosts, no creatures lurking in the shadows. It was worse. It was real. I saw myself, and I didn't like what I saw. The water was showing me something I didn't want to admit. I had been feeling it for a long time, that creeping dissatisfaction, that quiet hopelessness I never talked about. I had never been happy. Not really. I had spent so much time trying to ignore it, trying to convince myself I was fine, that things were normal, that this was just how life was. But the reflection didn't lie. I saw myself as I truly was. Not the person I wanted to be. Not the person I pretended to be. Just me. And I hated it. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My own face stared back, empty and lost, and for the first time, I knew I might never be able to change. That was the real fear. Not the darkness, not the woods, but the realization that no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried, I would always be the same. I tore my gaze away from the water and forced myself to move. I walked fast, my breaths uneven, my pulse hammering. The path felt longer than before, stretching endlessly through the darkness. The silence pressed in around me, heavier than before, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. When I reached my camp, I didn't stop moving. I threw my things into my pack, zipped the tent closed without care, and left. I didn't look back. I didn't camp alone again after that. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I was afraid of what I might see. I've spent a lot of time alone in the wilderness, while hunting, hiking, exploring, just being out where no one else is. It's where I feel the most free, but also where I've had some of the worst scares of my life. The kind that stay with you, that make you hesitate before heading out again, no matter how much you love it. Some of them I can explain, some I can't, and some I'd rather forget. But they all happened, and they all remind me how quickly things can go wrong when you're alone, miles from anyone who could help. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. Neither does the deep forest, the mountains, or the rivers. And neither do people, when you run into the wrong ones. I was in a slot canyon when the rain started. I had checked the forecast before heading out, like I always did. No real chance of rain, just a slight possibility of some clouds in the afternoon. I was deep in a narrow stretch of canyon, smooth walls rising on either side, just wide enough for me to stretch my arms out and touch both at the same time. There was only one way forward and one way back. That's the way it is in slot canyons. You don't have a lot of choices if something goes wrong. I wasn't thinking about rain when I first heard it. A dull, distant roar, like wind rushing through a tight space. But the air was still. Then I felt a drop on my arm. Looked up. The sky was a narrow strip above me, gray and shifting. A few more drops hit my face. I knew what was coming before I even turned back. The thing about flash floods is, they don't start where you are. They start miles away, in places you can't see, where the rain is already pouring down, filling up dry creek beds that turn into rivers in minutes. That water has nowhere to go but downhill, into canyons like the one I was standing in. I ran. The walls were too smooth, too high to climb. The floor was just wet sand, no rocks to scramble up. I pushed as fast as I could, lungs burning, trying to reach a wider part of the canyon where maybe, I could get up somewhere high. The sound grew louder, like a jet engine. Then I saw it. A wall of water, thick with mud, rolling toward me like something alive. It wasn't high, maybe 2 or 3 feet, but that was enough. It would knock me down, drag me under, pin me against the canyon walls. I had seconds. I jumped. There was a small ledge to my left, barely a foot wide. I grabbed at it, digging my fingers into a crack, kicking my feet against the wall to push myself up. My muscles screamed. I pulled, knowing if I slipped, that was it. My foot found a hold. My other hand gripped a tiny knob of rock. Then the water hit. The force of it slammed into my legs, almost tearing me away from the wall. My boots slipped, but my arms held. The water surged past, cold and fast, carrying sticks, sand, anything loose. It filled the canyon floor in seconds. I stayed up there, heart pounding, legs shaking, until the flood slowed to a thick, churning river. I was soaked in sweat, breathing so hard I felt dizzy. It was a long time before I climbed down. The canyon was unrecognizable. The floor had changed, reshaped in minutes by the force of the flood. If I had been just a little slower, I would have been part of it. It was just before dawn when I saw him. I was out bow hunting, alone, deep in the woods. The world was still dark, the kind of quiet that only exists before the sun rises. I was moving slow, trying not to make noise, trying to keep the wind in my favor. Then I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Human. I turned, gripping my bow. At first, I thought it was another hunter. But then I saw how he was walking. Stumbling, unsteady. The way he was swinging his arms, like he was trying to keep his balance. I could smell him before he got close. Alcohol. Sweat. Something else. Then he saw me. He stopped, swayed on his feet. I stood still, not moving, waiting to see what he'd do. He muttered something I couldn't hear, then suddenly lunged forward. I backed up fast. He came after me, reaching out. I didn't know if he wanted my gear, if he was just out of his mind, or if he meant to hurt me. I pulled an arrow from my quiver, held it in my hand like a dagger, ready to stab if he got too close. Then he stopped, just stood there, swaying. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I waited until the sun was fully up before I moved again. I should have known something was wrong the second I smelled it. I was pushing through a thick patch of thorn bushes, working my way toward a ridge, when the scent hit me. Chemical. Sharp. Wrong. Then I saw it. A makeshift camp, half hidden in the brush. A tarp strung between trees. Burned out cans. Plastic jugs. The kind of trash that doesn't belong in the woods. I froze. There was no sign of anyone, but that didn't mean they weren't there. People who cook meth in the middle of nowhere aren't the kind you want to surprise. They don't call the cops. They don't ask questions. They just deal with problems their own way. I backed up slow, every step careful. A twig snapped under my boot. Silence. Then movement. From inside the camp. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was a mile away. It was late afternoon when I saw them. Big, rangy farm dogs. A whole pack of them. They spotted me at the same time I spotted them. And they came straight for me. I ran for the nearest rock outcrop, scrambling up, pulling myself onto a wide, flat boulder. The dogs circled below, barking, growling, snapping at the air. I had my bow, but my arrows weren't meant for this. Most were blunts, for small game. Not much good against a pack of dogs. I sat still. Waited. The dogs didn't leave. Minutes passed. Half an hour. An hour. They paced, watched. Then, without warning, they turned and walked away, one by one, vanishing into the desert. I climbed down slow, watching the shadows. Then I hiked out, never looking back. I still go into the wilderness, but I know now how fast things can go wrong. The flood taught me that nature doesn't care about your plans. The drunk man taught me that people can be just as dangerous as anything else out there. The meth lab showed me that evil doesn't just exist in cities. And the dogs, they reminded me that sometimes you just get lucky. I don't take luck for granted anymore. I never wanted this place back. When I sold it, I thought I was finally free. Free from the nightmares, free from the sick feeling in my gut, free from whatever it was that lurked in the corners of the house, watching. I thought I had escaped. But the property had a way of pulling people in, and in my case, it yanked me back with both hands. When the new owners lost everything, their license, their sanity, their control over themselves, I was forced to take it back. They had done things in that house. Dark things. The damage was more than just broken windows and trashed walls. They had brought something out of the house, something that had been waiting, something that had been buried for too long. I had seen too much already. I had been living with the fear, pushing it down, forcing myself to pretend that the footsteps, the voices, the unnatural cold spots were all in my head. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore. Her. I don't know what she was. I don't even want to think about it now. But I saw her more than once. The first time was the worst. It happened on a night like any other. I was exhausted, my body aching, my mind stretched thin from the stress of trying to keep everything together. The 3 elderly residents I cared for were already asleep, their doors closed, their rooms quiet. I had been drifting in and out of an uneasy sleep when I had a dream, or at least I thought it was a dream. I was floating, not in the way dreams usually feel. This was different. I could feel the cold air pressing against my skin. I could feel my hair moving slightly, like there was a draft in the room. And then I saw him. Al. He was one of the residents, a quiet man in his late 70s. He slept on his back, his arms folded across his chest in a way that reminded me too much of a corpse. I saw him clearly, but it wasn't through my own eyes. I was hovering above him, looking down, moving closer, feeling something inside me curl with hunger, with some awful, crawling sensation that didn't belong to me. And then Al's eyes opened. He didn't move. He just stared up, stared straight into me, into whatever I was in that moment. I woke up gasping. The room was cold, my skin covered in goosebumps. For a few seconds, I sat there, breathing hard, trying to shake off the dream. Then I heard it. A voice. A woman's voice, hoarse and broken, singing. Ring around the rosy. It was coming from the baby monitor. I froze. My whole body locked up. I knew that voice didn't belong to anyone in the house. I was alone, apart from the 3 sleeping residents. The voice kept singing, dragging out the words, stretching them into something slow and wrong. My hands were shaking as I climbed out of bed. I didn't want to go to Al's room. I didn't want to see if he was lying the same way I had seen in my dream. But I had to. I stepped into the hallway, my breath fogging in front of me. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. The closer I got to his room, the worse it got. I turned the corner, and there he was, lying on his back, arms folded over his chest, just like in my dream. I felt my stomach drop. The voice was still singing. I ran back to my room, yanking the baby monitor from the wall. The cord snapped. I ripped the batteries out, throwing them to the floor. The voice didn't stop. It kept singing. I pulled the blankets over my head and sat there, too afraid to move. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember the cold and the feeling that something was standing right outside my door waiting. After that night, things got worse. The house felt different, like something had been stirred up, like something had finally woken up. Doors slammed on their own. The temperature would drop suddenly, no matter how high I turned up the heat. I'd hear scratching in the walls, in the floors, even though there were no rats, no mice, nothing that could make that kind of sound. Then there were the dreams. Always the same. Floating, looking through her eyes. Watching. Waiting. The worst part was that I never saw her fully. Just glimpses. A shape in the corner of my eye, a reflection in the window when no one was there. But I felt her. She was always there. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that stress and lack of sleep were making me see things. But I knew better. The house was rotting from the inside out. I could feel it in my body, in my mind. Even my health was failing. Doctors ran tests, found nothing. I was exhausted all the time. My skin was pale, my hands weak. Something was draining me. And then the death started. First, it was Al. I found him one morning, lying exactly as I had seen him in my dream. Cold. Still. Gone. Then the others. One by one. Even my partner. He lasted a few more months before he was gone too. I was the only one left. And the house wasn't finished with me. I don't know why I stayed. Maybe it was the debt. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was something worse. I knew I needed to leave. I knew I had to get out. But I didn't. I started avoiding certain rooms. Certain corners of the house where I could feel her waiting. Some nights, I'd wake up to the sound of breathing. Right next to my bed. I stopped looking in mirrors. I didn't want to see what was standing behind me. I was wasting away. No one could explain it. And I didn't want to try anymore. The house had taken everything from me. I put the property up for sale again. I just needed one buyer. One person desperate enough to take it. And then I'd be free. The day I signed the final paperwork, I didn't feel relief. I felt nothing. I packed what little I had left and drove away without looking back. But sometimes even now I hear it. A voice, soft, broken, whispering just at the edge of my hearing. Ring around the rosy. And I know the house is still waiting. For someone else. For the next person who won't believe. Not until it's too late. I've always loved the wilderness. There's something about being completely cut off from civilization, surrounded only by trees, mountains, and the vast silence of nature. I've gone on countless backpacking trips, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend. This time, I wasn't alone. My friend Mark and I had planned a 5-day trek deep into Washington State's backcountry. We had done our research, mapped out a good route, and packed light but efficiently. The area we chose wasn't on any major hiking trails. It was remote, untouched, perfect for escaping the noise of everyday life. We were experienced enough to handle rough terrain and unpredictable weather. What we weren't prepared for was the feeling of being watched. We started early in the morning, parking the car at a small pull-off on a dirt road that looked rarely used. From there, we hiked in, following an old logging road for the first few miles before veering off onto an unmarked game trail. It was rough, overgrown in places, but manageable. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The birds, the wind through the trees, even the occasional scurry of a squirrel, everything felt muted. "Man, it's almost too quiet," Mark said after a few hours. I nodded, feeling it too. There was an eerie stillness in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. But I pushed the thought away. We were deep in the forest, far from any human activity. It made sense for things to be quiet. We reached a small clearing by late afternoon and decided to make camp. A narrow stream ran nearby, perfect for filtering water. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night. The air was cool, the fire crackled, and for a while, everything felt normal. The next day, we packed up and hiked deeper into the forest. Our plan was to find a good spot near a larger river, about 10 miles in. The terrain got steeper, and the trees grew denser. The feeling of stillness hadn't left. If anything, it had gotten stronger. We found a decent clearing by late afternoon and set up camp again. As the sun dipped behind the trees, we sat by the fire, eating our meals and talking about life. Then, just as I was about to say something, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely there, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I stopped mid-sentence and looked at Mark. He was staring into the trees, his expression unreadable. "You heard that?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah." We both turned our flashlights toward the trees, scanning the darkness. Nothing. Just shadows and the occasional flicker of light against the trunks. "Must be the wind," Mark said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. Wind doesn't form words. We tried to shake it off, but the night felt different now. Heavier. When we finally went to our tents, I lay awake for hours listening. I didn't hear anything else, but the silence itself felt wrong. The next morning, we debated whether to move further in or stay put for another night. We decided to stay. It was a good campsite, close to water, and we were both probably just imagining things. By late afternoon, the air had changed. The stillness had deepened, and it felt like the forest was pressing in on us. I tried to ignore it, focusing on collecting firewood while Mark filtered water at the stream. Then, as I was arranging the logs by the fire pit, I heard it again. A whisper, but this time it was closer. It was the same hushed murmuring from the night before, low, unintelligible, like someone speaking just below the edge of comprehension. My body tensed. I turned, scanning the trees, but nothing moved. "Mark," I called out. "Yeah." His voice came from the stream, a good 30 feet away. I swallowed. "You hear that?" Silence. Then, after a moment, "Yeah." It wasn't just one whisper this time. It was several, overlapping, surrounding us. They weren't loud, but they were there. We stood back to back, flashlights sweeping the trees. Nothing. The whispering stopped. The forest held its breath again. We didn't talk much that night. We just sat by the fire, listening. The whispering didn't come back, at least not while we were awake. By morning, we were exhausted. Neither of us had slept much. Something about this place was wrong, and we both knew it. We agreed to pack up and start heading back. There was no reason to stay. The hike out was slow. The feeling of being watched never left. Every so often, we'd hear movement, branches shifting, leaves crunching, but whenever we stopped to look, nothing was there. Then, as we neared the area where we had camped the first night, the whispering returned. It was daylight, but it didn't matter. It was there, following us, just beyond our sight. A constant, steady murmur. We picked up the pace. Neither of us spoke. We just moved. Fast. When we finally reached the old logging road, the whispering stopped. Just stopped. The air felt normal again. The forest no longer pressed in on us. The silence was just silence. We didn't stop walking until we reached the car. As we loaded our gear, Mark finally spoke. "We're never coming back here." I nodded. Agreed. We never told anyone else about what happened. It didn't feel like something people would understand. But we knew one thing for sure. Something was in those woods with us. And it was watching. I was 16 when my family decided to rent a remote cabin for a long weekend. My dad had found it through some obscure listing, lured in by its cheap price and promise of absolute seclusion. He had always preferred quiet, isolated places over tourist-heavy spots, and this cabin, nestled deep in the woods of Pennsylvania, seemed perfect. It was about a 4-hour drive from our home. The first half of the journey was spent on highways, but as we got closer, the roads became narrower and rougher. The last stretch was a winding dirt road, cutting through dense forest. Trees towered on either side, their branches stretching overhead, blocking most of the sunlight. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow through the trees. The cabin itself was small and old, built from dark, weathered wood. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest in every direction. There was no phone service, no Wi-Fi, just us, the trees, and whatever lived among them. As soon as we got out of the car, I felt the silence. Not just quiet, but an eerie stillness. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the occasional creak of the trees shifting in the wind. My parents didn't seem to notice. My dad unlocked the door, while my mom carried in our bags. I stood outside for a moment, scanning the tree line. Something about this place unsettled me, though I couldn't explain why. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living room with an old couch and a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. Everything smelled faintly of damp wood. My room was at the far end of the cabin, with a single bed and a small window that overlooked the forest. As night fell, we settled in. My dad started a fire in the stove, and my mom cooked a simple dinner. We ate by candlelight since the cabin's electricity was weak, and the single overhead bulb barely lit the room. The quiet outside felt heavier after dark, pressing against the walls of the cabin. That first night passed without incident, though I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something standing outside my window, just beyond the trees, watching. The second night was when it happened. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The cabin was silent, the only sound my parents' soft breathing from their room down the hall. Then I noticed a faint glow outside my window. I sat up, heart pounding. It wasn't bright, just a weak, flickering light moving through the trees. My first thought was that it was my dad. Maybe he had gone outside for some reason. But as I watched, the light wove between the trees, dipping and rising, disappearing and reappearing. A fire. Someone was carrying a fire through the woods. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to the window. Pressing my face against the glass, I strained to see. The light was further away now, deeper in the forest. It moved unnaturally, too smooth, too fluid. Then it stopped. For several long seconds, nothing moved. The light hovered, barely visible between the trunks. I held my breath, waiting. Then something stepped into view. A shadowy figure, just beyond the reach of the glow. It was tall, its outline barely distinguishable against the dark trees. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, watching the cabin. A sharp chill ran down my spine. I wanted to wake my parents, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, locked in place by a feeling I couldn't explain. Fear, yes, but something else too. Something deeper. Then, slowly, the figure stepped back into the trees. The light faded, and then it was gone. I stayed at the window for what felt like forever, heart hammering. I kept expecting the light to return, for the figure to step back into view. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled back into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin, listening to the silence outside until sleep finally claimed me. The next morning, I told my dad what I had seen. He frowned, but didn't seem too concerned. "Probably just a hunter," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "A hunter? At 2 in the morning, carrying a fire." He shrugged. "Some people go night hunting. Maybe they were just passing through." I knew he was just trying to reassure me, but something in his voice sounded forced, like he didn't fully believe his own words. After breakfast, I decided to check outside. My parents were busy tidying up the cabin, so I stepped out alone. The morning air was cool, the forest still eerily quiet. I walked toward the tree-line, to the spot where I had seen the light. The ground was damp from the night's dew, the leaves dark and heavy. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints. They were large, human-shaped, and led from the trees toward the cabin. The steps were deep, as if the person had been walking slowly, deliberately. And then they stopped. The last footprint was just a few feet from the cabin wall, directly beneath my bedroom window. My stomach clenched. Whoever had been in the woods last night hadn't just been passing through. They had come all the way to the cabin. They had stood outside my window, watching. I swallowed hard and turned back to the cabin. I didn't tell my parents about the footprints. I didn't want them to brush it off again. But from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That evening, I refused to go to bed right away. I stayed in the living room with my parents, pretending to read a book while my dad stoked the fire. Every few minutes, I glanced at the window, waiting for the light to return. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. Just as I was beginning to think maybe it wouldn't happen again, I saw it. The same flickering glow, moving through the trees. My breath caught in my throat. My hands clenched around the book. Then it stopped. And this time it was closer. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The figure emerged again, stepping into the faint glow of the fire. But this time I could see more. A man, tall, thin, wearing what looked like an old, tattered coat. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his gaze, heavy and unblinking. He was facing the cabin, facing me. Then, slowly, he lifted something in his hand. A lantern. He held it up slightly, as if presenting it. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows across his figure. Then he turned, and without a sound, he walked back into the woods. I sat frozen for what felt like hours. My parents had fallen asleep, unaware. I wanted to wake them, to tell them what I had seen, but some instinct told me not to. Instead, I sat by the fire, wide-eyed, waiting for dawn. The next morning, I convinced my parents to leave early. I didn't tell them the full truth, just that I was feeling uneasy, that I wasn't enjoying the trip. My dad seemed hesitant, but my mom agreed. By noon, we were packed and on the road. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood silent in the clearing, the forest dense and unmoving behind it. And just beyond the trees, barely visible through the branches, I saw a faint flicker of light. The camp was massive. It stretched for what felt like miles, clusters of wooden bunkhouses scattered between thick patches of trees, open fields, a barnyard, even a pool. It had been built for summer campers, but since it was only May, my synagogue was using it for a weekend event. 3 nights of outdoor activities, prayers, bonding, standard stuff. By the last night, everyone was exhausted. The days had been packed with group hikes, team-building exercises, and campfire dinners. By the time the sun set, most people were already winding down for the night, getting ready to enjoy the last sleep before we packed up in the morning. But there was still one final event for the seniors. A midnight hangout in the library, something special just for the 12th graders. I wanted to go. It was the last real night, and I didn't want to miss out. The problem was, I wasn't staying in the senior bunks. My cousin was a year younger than me, and we had chosen to bunk together, which meant I was on the far side of the camp. And by the time I found out about the hangout, most people were already half asleep. No one was going to walk with me. I almost stayed in bed, almost decided it wasn't worth it. But people kept telling me how fun it was going to be. The last big gathering before we all went home. I didn't want to be the one who missed out, the one who had to hear about it secondhand. So I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Just a short walk across the camp. Alone. At midnight. I stepped out of the bunk, pulling my hoodie tighter around me. The night air had a bite to it, damp, cool, carrying the distant scent of pine and earth. The sky overhead was clear, stars sharp and bright. I turned on my phone flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path in front of me. The dirt road through camp was wide enough for trucks and maintenance vehicles, lined with trees on both sides. There were streetlights, but they were few and far between, little islands of yellow light spaced just far enough apart that most of the walk would be spent in darkness. At first, it wasn't so bad. The camp was completely silent except for the occasional rustling of wind through the leaves. I kept my pace steady, listening to the crunch of my sneakers on the gravel. But as I moved deeper into the camp, something started gnawing at me. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, something small at first. A growing awareness of just how empty the camp was, how far away I was from anyone else, how quiet it had gotten. My footsteps sounded louder. Too loud. The trees on either side of me seemed to close in a little more. I kept going, trying to shake the unease, but I started noticing things I hadn't thought about before. The road was uneven in places, ruts and dips from rain and old tire tracks. Shadows stretched long and twisted from the trees, moving whenever my flashlight shifted. The wind picked up, and I swore I heard something creak, a loose wooden sign somewhere, maybe. I tried not to look at the trees too much. They were dense, packed tightly together, and my flashlight wasn't strong enough to see far into them. Just dark spaces between trunks, shifting in the wind. Then I reached the soccer field. It was an open stretch of land, completely empty, bordered by a low wooden fence. Beyond it, more trees. The field was one of the few places where the sky was fully open, moonlight shining down over the grass. I was halfway past it when I heard something. A sound. A giggle. It wasn't loud. It wasn't right next to me. But it was there, clear, sharp, cutting through the silence. I froze. My brain immediately scrambled for an explanation. Wind. An animal? Something shifting in the trees? It had sounded human. Something about it made my skin crawl. I didn't turn. I didn't look. I just ran. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, my breath coming fast and sharp in the cold air. The library wasn't far, but in that moment, it felt like miles. My flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted, shadows jerking across the ground. The dirt road blurred under my feet. The bunks, the buildings, the trees, everything passed in a rush, nothing fully registering. I didn't stop until I reached the library. The door was unlocked, and I yanked it open, practically stumbling inside. The warmth of the room hit me immediately, the light too bright after the darkness outside. I was breathing hard, my heart still hammering, but I forced myself to walk in casually, like nothing had happened. I didn't mention it to anyone. I stayed for the hangout, laughed at jokes, listened to music, tried to shake the lingering nerves. But when it came time to head back, I wasn't about to make that walk again. One of the teacher's kids had a pickup truck. I asked for a ride back, made up some excuse about being tired, not wanting to walk in the cold. I sat in the passenger seat as we drove through the camp, headlights cutting through the darkness. The road looked different from inside the truck. Smaller, less intimidating. The trees weren't as overwhelming, the open fields just open fields. I tried to tell myself it had been nothing. An animal, a trick of the wind. Maybe someone had been outside, walking to their own bunk. Maybe I had just imagined it. But even now, I still think about that sound. The way it cut through the silence. The way it made my blood run cold. I never saw anything, but I didn't need to. I still think about that night, years later. It wasn't the kind of horror you expect, the kind where you see something impossible, something that forces you to question reality. It wasn't a ghost or a creature or even a person. It was worse. It was the complete absence of something that should have been there. Something real, something physical. We had all seen the fire. We had built it with our own hands. And then, in an instant, it was gone. It was the middle of autumn when my friends and I decided to go on a weekend camping trip in the Adirondacks. The group consisted of me, my best friend Mark, and two other guys we'd known since college, Jake and Trevor. We had all camped together before, so this wasn't new to us. We weren't survival experts, but we knew the basics: how to set up a tent, how to start a fire, how to navigate in the woods. The place we picked was deep in the forest, far from any designated camping grounds. Mark had found it a few years back while hiking, and he swore it was one of the best spots, totally secluded, with a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. No nearby roads, no trails. Just wilderness. We parked miles away and hiked in with our gear, the late afternoon sun filtering through the thinning leaves. The temperature was perfect, cool but not cold. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was already sinking. It was a beautiful spot, just like Mark had described. The ground was mostly flat, covered in soft earth and fallen leaves. A few thick logs sat around the remains of an old fire pit, left behind by whoever had camped there before. We dropped our packs and got to work setting up. Once the tents were up and our gear was organized, the next priority was a fire. The sun was nearly gone by then, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. We gathered dry branches and twigs, stacking them in the fire pit. Trevor had brought some fire starter sticks, so getting it going was easy. Within minutes, flames flickered to life, crackling and sending up little spirals of smoke. We sat around it, warming our hands, stretching out sore legs. Mark pulled out a small flask of whiskey and took a swig before passing it around. As the night deepened, we relaxed. We cooked some food over the fire, hot dogs, some foil-wrapped potatoes we had buried in the coals. We talked about old stories, joked about stupid things we'd done in college. It was peaceful. The fire was strong, burning bright and steady. We fed it regularly, making sure it wouldn't die down too soon. There was no wind, no rain, perfect conditions for keeping a fire going all night if we wanted to. Eventually, one by one, we started turning in. Trevor was the first to crawl into his tent. Jake followed about half an hour later. Mark and I stayed up the longest, staring into the fire, enjoying the quiet. Around midnight, we finally decided to call it a night. The fire was still burning, though not as high as before. It would smolder for hours. At worst, it would burn down to glowing embers by morning. Either way, there was no chance it would be gone completely. I crawled into my sleeping bag, closed my eyes, and let the warmth of the fire lull me to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The inside of my tent was dark, but something felt off. The air was colder than before, and everything seemed unnervingly silent. No crackling fire. No distant hoots of an owl. Just complete stillness. I lay there for a few moments, disoriented. Then I realized I had to pee. Reluctantly, I unzipped my sleeping bag and pulled on my jacket. The cold hit me immediately, sharper than before. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent flap, and stepped out. The clearing was dark, the moon hidden behind clouds. My breath came out in a thin mist. I turned my flashlight on, aiming it toward the fire pit, and froze. The fire was gone. Completely gone. Not just burned down. Not just smoldering. It was as if there had never been a fire at all. I took a step closer, my heart hammering. The fire pit was empty. No embers. No ashes. No half-burned logs. Just blackened dirt. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the area. Nothing looked disturbed. No sign of wind. No footprints that weren't ours. Just the empty fire pit. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I turned and hurried to Mark's tent, whispering his name. Mark. Mark, wake up. A few seconds later, his groggy voice responded. What? Get out here. Now. There was some shuffling, then the sound of his tent unzipping. He emerged, squinting against my flashlight beam. What's wrong? I pointed. Look. He followed my gaze to the fire pit. His face shifted from confusion to disbelief. What the hell? He walked over, kneeling beside it. He ran a hand over the dirt. It was cold. This isn't possible, he muttered. It should still be warm at least. I felt a heavy knot forming in my stomach. Where's the wood? The ashes? Mark shook his head. I don't know. This doesn't make sense. We woke Trevor and Jake. They stumbled out, annoyed at first, but when they saw the fire pit, the irritation vanished. You guys are screwing with us, right? Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. Why the hell would we do that? I snapped. Trevor crouched down, running his fingers through the dirt. It's like we never even had a fire. Silence settled over us. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The woods pressed in around us, the trees like silent watchers. I suddenly had the urge to pack up and leave, but none of us wanted to admit how shaken we were. We'll figure it out in the morning, Mark finally said. Maybe something happened we're not thinking of. None of us believed that. But what else could we do? Reluctantly, we went back to our tents. I lay awake for hours, listening, waiting for something, anything, to explain what had happened. But nothing came. At first light, we got up and examined the site again. The firewood was never found. No charred remains, no burnt-out logs hidden nearby. The ground where the fire had been was ice cold. There was no rational explanation. No wind strong enough to scatter everything. No rain to wash it away. No animals that could have carried it off so completely. We left that morning, cutting the trip short. None of us said much as we packed up. Years later, I still think about that night. I've gone over every possible explanation, but nothing makes sense. The fire was there, and then it wasn't, and I don't know what could have taken it. The woods are never truly silent, not even in the dead of night. I had been camping plenty of times before, and I knew the usual sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind moving through the trees. But this night felt different. We had set up camp deep in a forest that was miles from the nearest town. A group of us, 6 in total, all experienced campers. We weren't idiots. We had checked the weather, packed extra food, made sure our tents were positioned in a safe clearing. There was nothing unusual about the trip, nothing that should have made me uneasy. And yet, as I lay in my tent staring at the ceiling, I felt it. That creeping sensation that something wasn't right. At first, I blamed it on the isolation. We were far out, and that kind of remoteness had a way of playing tricks on the mind. I rolled onto my side, forcing my eyes shut, telling myself it was nothing. Then I heard it. A sound outside. At first, it was faint. Just the snap of a twig. Maybe a raccoon, maybe just the forest settling. I held my breath, listening. Then, clear as day, a laugh. Not a normal laugh. Not something casual or distant. It was high-pitched, sharp, almost shrill. Like someone gasping between jagged breaths. A cackle. It sent a cold wave through my body. I sat up, my pulse quickening. I listened again, waiting to hear it repeat. The tent was zipped shut, and I had no intention of opening it to look. I told myself it had to be one of the others. Maybe someone was joking around, trying to freak us out. But it hadn't come from any of our tents. It had been outside, close, just past the tree line. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to come again. It didn't. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down. The forest had fallen into silence. No wind, no rustling, just thick, suffocating stillness. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, the fear felt distant. It was easier to convince myself I had imagined it. Lack of sleep could do that. The others were already gathered around the fire, making coffee, frying up some breakfast. I grabbed my gear and joined them, shoving the night's unease to the back of my mind. We had just started eating when we heard it. A howl. At first, it was distant, a lone voice cutting through the trees, somewhere far out in the forest. Then another. Then another. It was hard to tell how many. Maybe 5, maybe more. The first howl had made us all pause. The second made us look at each other. The third made us realize we were surrounded. The sound was coming from all around us, cutting off any obvious path back to the road. I swallowed, gripping my fork tighter, staring into the trees. Wolves weren't common in this area. Coyotes, maybe. But they didn't behave like this. They didn't move in tight packs. They didn't close in like this. For a moment, nobody moved. The fire crackled. The wind shifted through the branches above. Then another sound. Not a howl. Movement. The underbrush rustling. The snap of branches. The sound of something shifting in the shadows, just beyond our vision. I stood slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The howls had stopped, but now the woods were filled with something worse. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that made my skin crawl. Something was out there. No, not just something. Many things. Waiting. Watching. The feeling of being hunted is not something you forget. We weren't just in the woods anymore. We were in something's territory. I gripped my knife, my pulse hammering. We needed to move. Needed to pack up, get out, do something other than just sit there waiting. But before we could react, the silence broke. Not with a howl. Not with movement. With another laugh. The same sharp, jagged cackle from the night before. Not from one of us. Not from the woods. From behind one of the tents. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and moved. The others didn't need to be told twice. We left the fire, left the food, left whatever the hell was lurking in the trees. We walked fast, then faster, then finally broke into a full sprint when we heard something. Something big, moving through the brush behind us. We didn't stop. Not even when we heard another laugh echo through the trees. We didn't look back. We just ran. It took nearly an hour before we made it back to the road. The forest behind us was still. But I swear, just before we piled into the car, I heard it again. A single, distant cackle. And I knew whatever was out there, it had let us go. This time. I used to camp alone in the woods. I wasn't supposed to, but no one could really stop me. It was peaceful. Something about being out there, away from everything, made the world feel smaller, simpler. No lights, no roads, no hum of distant traffic. Just me, the trees, and the night. It was never about survival. I wasn't out there building shelters from scratch or rubbing sticks together to make a fire. I brought what I needed, a tent, a sleeping bag, a small gas stove. Just enough to be comfortable, nothing more. I knew the woods well, and I wasn't scared of the dark. Or at least, I hadn't been. The last time I went camping alone, I saw something I still can't explain. I wasn't alone after that, not really. People told me I wasn't allowed to go anymore, that I was at risk. At risk of what, exactly? I don't know. Maybe I don't want to know. That night, I set up camp in a familiar clearing, deep enough in the woods that I wouldn't run into anyone, but not so far that I couldn't make it back easily. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, the air was cool but not cold, and the sky was clear enough that the moonlight made everything glow a pale silver. I set up my small tent, unpacked my bag, and got everything arranged the way I liked it. The routine was familiar, comforting. By the time I finished, the last light of the sun had faded from the sky, and the world was blue-black and quiet. I made a small meal, sat against a fallen log, and listened to the woods. It was peaceful, like it always was. I didn't have a fire. I never did. Fires drew attention, and I didn't want to be seen. After eating, I walked a little. Not far, just to stretch my legs, to listen. The night was completely still, no wind moving through the branches, no rustling in the undergrowth. It felt like the woods were waiting. That's when I saw it. It was far away, at the edge of the field beyond the trees. A figure, moving slowly across the open ground. I stopped. The figure wasn't walking. It wasn't running. It was floating. It was dark against the pale grass, a tall, human-like shape that drifted, smooth and silent, across the field. There was no sound, no footsteps, no rustling of clothing. It moved in a straight line, steady and unbroken, as if it was gliding on an invisible rail. I stared, my mind scrambling for an explanation. A trick of the light? A person on a hoverboard? One of those self-balancing things people had for about a month before they all disappeared? I stood frozen, waiting to see where it would go, if it would slow, stop, turn. It didn't. It just kept moving, perfectly level, until it reached the far side of the field and disappeared behind a line of trees. I didn't breathe for a long time. Then I moved. Fast. I pushed through the undergrowth, branches snapping under my boots, my heart hammering. I needed to see. I needed to know what it was. When I reached the edge of the field, I stopped. The moon was bright, the open ground silver and empty. No footprints. No tracks. No one. I scanned the far side, expecting to see movement in the trees, a figure disappearing between the trunks, but there was nothing. Just the woods, silent and still. I forced myself to step forward, to cross the field, to check the place where it had vanished. There was nothing there. No path, no signs of movement. No broken branches, no scuffed dirt, nothing to suggest that anyone, had passed through. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no insects, just silence. A weight settled in my stomach. I turned and walked back to my camp. I didn't run, but I wanted to. When I reached my tent, I stopped outside, staring at the fabric. It suddenly felt too small, too thin. A flimsy layer of nylon between me and whatever else was out there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat inside my tent, my back against my pack, listening, waiting. I left at first light. People said the woods were haunted. I never believed it. Still don't. But I know what I saw, and I know I won't be going back. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. Something about the solitude, the rhythm of my own footsteps, the crisp air filling my lungs. It gave me a sense of peace I rarely found elsewhere. This time, I had chosen a remote trail in the Great Smoky Mountains, one that wasn't particularly well known. It wasn't on any major maps, but a few experienced hikers had mentioned it in forums. They described it as quiet, overgrown, and a little challenging, but incredibly scenic. That sounded perfect to me. I set out early, just after sunrise, my backpack snug against my shoulders. The trail started as a narrow dirt path winding through dense forest, the morning light filtering through the thick canopy above. Birds chirped and squirrels rustled in the undergrowth. The air smelled fresh, a mix of damp earth and pine. I had checked the weather before leaving. Clear skies, cool temperatures, no sign of rain. Ideal conditions. I planned to hike about 12 miles to a small clearing by a stream where I'd set up camp for the night. Then, I'd hike back the next morning. It wasn't a particularly long trip, but the solitude and challenge were what I craved. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I made good time, stopping only to drink water or adjust my pack. The trail was rough in places, fallen logs, thick brush, and roots twisting up from the dirt, but nothing I couldn't handle. It was around midday when I first noticed it. That creeping sensation, the one that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I paused, listening. The forest was still. Too still. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls. Just silence. The kind that presses in on you, heavy and unnatural. I turned, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing. Just tall, unmoving trunks stretching in every direction. Shaking off the feeling, I pressed on, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I was alone out here. An hour later, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the quick, skittering movement of a deer or a squirrel. These were slow, deliberate, heavy. I froze mid-step, listening. The sound had come from behind me, just off the trail. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. Nothing. The trees stood silent, thick shadows stretching between them. The undergrowth looked undisturbed. But I knew what I had heard. It wasn't my own footsteps echoing. There had been a second set. A chill crept over me, but I forced myself to keep moving. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I still had miles to go before I reached my campsite. The logical part of my brain told me it was just an animal. A black bear, maybe, or a coyote. But I didn't fully believe that. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. The uneven terrain had slowed me down, and I had to take more breaks than I planned. But I was close, less than a mile from my campsite. I could hear the faint sound of water in the distance, the stream I'd be camping beside. Then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. A figure. It was standing deep in the trees, partially hidden by the undergrowth. My brain struggled to process what I was looking at. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, human-shaped, unmoving. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. It was gone. The spot where it had been was empty now, just the same dense forest as before. Had I imagined it? My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a slow step forward, then another. My eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for movement. But there was nothing, just silence. A part of me wanted to turn around, to hike back to my car and forget about camping for the night. But the more stubborn part of me, the part that didn't want to admit fear, pushed forward. I reached the clearing just before sunset. The stream was exactly as I had pictured, wide, shallow, flowing gently over smooth stones. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I forced myself through the motions of setting up camp. Tent first, then gathering firewood. I built a small fire, just enough for warmth and light. I made dinner, dehydrated camping food, barely edible but filling. As darkness settled over the forest, my surroundings faded into blackness beyond the firelight. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see something standing just at the edge of the light. But there was nothing. Just as I was starting to convince myself I had imagined everything, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow, measured, circling my camp. I gripped my flashlight, pointing it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were trees. No movement. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, barely breathing. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be another hiker? A poacher? Someone lost. But why wouldn't they call out? Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. Finally, I forced myself into my tent, zipping it shut. I kept my knife within reach, my ears straining for any sound. I must have drifted off at some point, because when I opened my eyes, it was early morning. Pale light filtered through the fabric of my tent. The fire had burned down to cold ash. For a brief moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been in my head, until I stepped outside. There, just beyond the extinguished fire, was a footprint. A single, clear print in the dirt. Human. Barefoot. It was large, the toes slightly curled into the earth as if whoever, or whatever, had been standing there had been watching me sleep. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. I didn't pack up my gear. I didn't eat breakfast. I just grabbed my essentials, shoved them into my pack, and left everything else behind. I hiked back faster than I ever had before, my legs burning, my heart pounding. I didn't stop. Not for water, not for rest. I didn't look back. Only when I reached my car, locking the doors behind me, did I finally let myself breathe. I never told anyone the full story. Not my family, not my friends. I just said I had a weird feeling and left early. I never went back for the rest of my gear. I still go hiking, still enjoy the solitude, but I don't camp alone anymore. And every so often, when I'm out on a trail and the forest goes quiet, I remember that night. Because whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a person, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. Camping on the South Downs was something we did all the time. It wasn't an official campsite or anything, just a patch of woods we knew well. There was something about being out there, away from everything, with nothing but the trees and the night, that made it feel like we had our own world. We didn't need tents or campfires, just some old sleeping bags and a tarp strung between trees to keep off any rain. This was one of those summer nights where the air was warm, the sky was clear, and the moon was so bright it might as well have been a street lamp. There were 10 of us that night. We'd set up in a clearing, the trees surrounding us like the walls of a room. No one had brought much food, just some crisps, a few sandwiches, and a couple bottles of cheap cider. It wasn't about eating. It was about being out there, messing around, and doing whatever we wanted with no one to tell us otherwise. At around 1 a.m., I got the urge to walk. Not far, just into the trees a little, stretch my legs. 2 of my friends, Liam and Chris, decided to come with me. We didn't take anything, just the phones in our pockets. The moon was bright enough that we didn't really need torches. The woods looked different at night, the silver light giving everything a sharp, unreal quality. Shadows stretched long between the trees, and the further we walked, the more the sounds of our group faded away until it was just us and the quiet. We moved in single file along a narrow path, our footsteps barely making a sound against the dirt. The night air was completely still. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. Unlike other parts of the world, the bugs in England don't make much noise at night, so it was eerily silent. That's when we saw the glow through the trees. At first, it was just a flicker of orange between the trunks, like the ember of a cigarette, but as we got closer, we saw it was a fire. A campfire. Not small, either. It was big enough to send dancing shadows up into the branches above it. The firelight made the figures around it look strange, their faces lit from below, casting deep shadows across their features. They had a few large tents set up behind them, proper ones, the kind you'd bring for a long stay. They weren't kids like us either. They were adults. We stopped. I don't know why we didn't notice them sooner. Maybe it was the way the terrain dipped slightly, or the fact that they weren't making much noise either. We were close, too close. A thin screen of bushes stood between us and them, and we hadn't been seen. We crouched low, barely breathing. There was something about stumbling upon another group like this that felt off. We weren't supposed to be here. Not that we were trespassing, but there was an unspoken rule about these kinds of places. When you camp somewhere unofficial, it feels like yours, like you're the only ones out there. Seeing another group doing the same thing shattered that illusion. Through a mix of hand signals and quiet whispers, we decided to mess with them. It was stupid, but we were 16, and it felt like the perfect opportunity. Liam was the first to make a sound. He could drop his voice unnaturally low, and when he let out a long, slow "come here," it cut through the night like something straight out of a horror film. The moment he finished, I screamed. Not just any scream, but a high, terrified, gut-wrenching shriek. I poured everything into it, making it sound as real as possible. A desperate, human sound, like someone was being dragged into the trees against their will. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it felt longer. The kind of scream that raises the hairs on the back of your neck. Then we ran. We didn't wait for a reaction. We didn't look back. We slipped away into the dark, using nothing but the moonlight to guide us. I don't remember if I heard anything behind us. If they shouted, if they ran, if they even reacted at all. My heart was pounding too hard, and all I could focus on was moving. By the time we got back to our camp, we were out of breath but buzzing with adrenaline. The others could tell something had happened, but we didn't tell them right away. We just collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard, laughing under our breath. Eventually, we told them. They thought it was hilarious, but after a while, the excitement died down. The idea of another group being out there stuck in my head. We weren't as alone as we thought. For a long time, I just lay there staring up at the sky, listening. Not just to our own sounds, but to everything else. The woods had changed. They felt different now, like something was awake that wasn't before. I kept expecting to hear footsteps approaching, or distant voices in the dark. I kept wondering what they thought had happened, if they thought someone was really out there, hurt and screaming for help. I never knew if they came looking. If they walked through the trees with torches, scanning the darkness, trying to find the source of that awful sound. I never knew if they packed up and left, or if they stayed, pretending it hadn't happened, hoping it wouldn't happen again. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined what it must have been like to be them, sitting around their fire, when that voice came out of the trees. And then the scream. I wonder if they ever camped there again.